Welcome to another Talkingbass podcast, and here we are with Anthony Muthurajah. I did say that right, didn't I?
Nailed it.
How are you doing?
I'm okay, man. How are you? How's things?
I'm good. Yeah. How's things been? I mean, this is the question everybody gets asked over the past year, everybody gets asked this question. How's it been going with all of the lockdowns and all the pandemic stuff for you?
Man, I think for me personally, it's a little odd, but I've really enjoyed the downtime of not playing at all. It's really helped reignite my love for practice. It just made me realize how much I miss practicing for real,
Yeah.
So it really has gotten me into a very productive zone altogether. And also gave me the opportunity to venture into something I've been contemplating for a long time, which was to teach more than I would play. So that was quite an eye-opener for me, and the pandemic made it a reality for me to actually just get into it rather than plan for it, So, yeah, all things said and done, it's been pretty good for me, I'm fortunate and I'm glad, but yeah, so far so good.
In case anybody doesn't realize, hasn't watched you before, you've actually got a really cool YouTube channel. Teaching and stuff. How's that going at the moment?
It's going pretty good. I won't say it's like I've been running it for a little over 4 years now, and considering the type of content I post, it is doing really good. Because that was one of the things when I started off. It's like, should I try to cater or tailor the material to all kinds of bass players? But then, there's many channels. Funny enough, I was just remembering how I used to watch even videos from your channel ages ago when I was just starting to get into playing bass properly. And I was just like, there is already good content in a specific zone of, wherever you're starting off from. So I was like, let me just try and see what this would bring out. So it's been doing good. It has translated to a lot of networking for me too, in terms of... doing gigs, whether it's abroad or locally, and students as well. I got a couple of years ago, I got the brand new heavies gig just because of the access to the YouTube channel, because I also post videos of me playing or doodling and stuff like that. So yeah, it's helped build a network of just musicians and fellow bass players all over the place. So yeah, it's been doing good, and I'm glad I got into it, even though the first year was just so, I won't say depressing, but just really hard, because you've done this before. You don't see the return just yet in terms of a following or just growth, not even financially speaking, So it was tricky, but once I got past the first year, it just started to flow in. It started feeling more natural, so I've kind of kept at it, and I'm happy with how it's doing so far.
Yeah, it takes a while to get your own kind of voice and own kind of voice, obviously, not just speaking, but in terms of an actual, the look of it, the whole bit. God, I look back at my old videos and I hate them. I'm just embarrassed by them. And it just takes so long to get it to where you want it to be. And I think you are so right with, that thing about finding your niche. Like, to my own kind of detriment, from the start, I ended up trying to do like lots of different things. And it's kind of become, I suppose, my thing in a way, that like I might do rock, jazz, the theory, blah, blah, blah. But the problem with that is you don't really get a focused demographic that you're working to, that you're performing to. And I think it is a lot better, and a lot of the channels grow a lot better when they find their niche, they find the people that really want to see that stuff and then cater to them. And you've really nailed that. And like I said, just in case anybody's not seen Anthony play, it's pretty impressive, to say the least. Phenomenal playing. Virtuosity, through the roof. And I found you ages ago. I can't remember what the video was. There was I can't remember what it was, but I remember watching it, and there were a few things that stood out. One was your tone. I just love it. I can't remember which bass you were using at the time, but the tone was so good.
Probably the Squire.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. And just your vocabulary on the instrument is just like really, really lovely. You know, the actual lines that you play and all of that. And it's the kind of thing where anybody out there that's wanting to learn to play in a, for want of a better word, with a jazz vocabulary, because I know that you're not just a jazz player, obviously, but like anybody that's wanting to, you know, develop that side of the playing, then your channel is really good for it, because I love the way that you actually explain a lot of the stuff, because you don't get bogged down too much in the lingo and in the theory too much. It's more to do with the actual vocabulary itself and about kind of thought process, which is way more important than, you know, knowing all the nuts and bolts of the theory, you know, because obviously that's not what you're thinking when you're actually soloing or playing bass lines. So anybody that's not seen Anthony, you know, his channel, and you're into that kind of stuff, then just go check it out. But I mean, like I said, you've kind of got your niche now.
Yeah, it took a while for me to figure it out, because even in terms of a niche, I think one of the things people tend to recognize me for a lot more than anything else is just how I am a big fan of the melodic minor scale, for example.
Yeah.
Because that's something people get so specific in terms of questions with me, is just literally to do with that scale. So I just started to embrace that, and it really helped me further develop not just a niche in terms of content creation, but actually even my music. It gave me a sense of direction as to where I really hear and see myself, you know, so it helped develop a voice overall in terms of just musicianship and everything else that came with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of musicianship, you're obviously also quite a multi-instrumentalist as well, because you often feature keys and guitar on your channel. And it was something I was going to kind of ask you, but also just to kind of talk to you about. It's one of those things that I keep mentioning to people that, you know, in terms of learning bass, I mean, really what people should be thinking is learn music, obviously, rather than just thinking learn bass. And one of the things that I think goes unspoken is that a lot of players, especially a lot of good players, play other instruments. You know, it's very rare that you actually get a top guy that can't play any other instruments. How do you feel that it's influenced the way that you play bass? And did you play other instruments before you played bass?
Yeah, so my first instrument is the drums, and that is something I still play a lot. And so I came from there, eventually got into guitar, and only picked up bass when I went to college. And it was strange because obviously as a guitar player, your touch is pretty bad. You know, it's too light. You try to dig in way too hard to make it sound deep, but then the mechanics are so different. So in order for me to really get into the whole world of playing bass, I had to drop the guitar completely. And then I think about 3 years ago, 2018 is when I picked it up again, because I felt like, you know what, I think I know what my hands need to go through in terms of just touch, being able to play the different instruments. But in terms of influence, you know, I think for me personally, because of how much time I spent on the bass, having made that switch, I just really started to treat it like how a piano player practices harmony, for instance, which incorporates voice leading by default, you know, moving your inner voices and then the outer voices. So I started doing all of that on the bass a lot, to the point that I started to realize, man, I'm playing too much of this. I might as well jump to another instrument for that particular purpose, you know. So for instance, as of the last year and a half, my chord chops on the bass has not gone down, but it's a little rusty just because I haven't been doing it much, because I rather go to the piano now. So I think in terms of influence, I think it's really influenced the way I approach composition and arrangements, particularly because I start to realize I don't need to pull everything out of a single instrument. you can just evenly distribute it. So music, I feel like, works best that way. And that's how I enjoy the records I enjoy. I feel like it's like you listen to Coltrane's album and I feel like you just remove Elvin's ride cymbal, I think the album will fall apart. Or maybe you could remove Garrison out of it. So it's like, these little influences of how it can affect what's going on with each instrument. So I think, because it's like, I tell this to people all the time when the whole thought and topic of playing different instrument comes through, is that at the end of the day, the difference between two instruments, I think, are just the sound of it and the technique involved to produce that sound. As far as what goes into playing it, it's the same. It's the same minor 7 on any instrument. It's the same major 7 anywhere. So, I think that commonality, that link, is by default an influence for me. So
yeah, I started on keys, organ, when I was a kid.
Oh, nice.
A long time before I started bass. I didn't start bass till I was like 14, 15, something like that. And I'd started keys when I was like, 7, 8 or whatever. And I found that I've only thought about this since I've started doing more of the channel or teaching particularly, that foundation that I'd got where, you know the notes of the chords, how a bass line fits with chords, about chord voicing, they're not little things, but they are when you're learning the instrument. When you just start playing piano, it's like, what's a C major chord? Is it a C, E, and G? And you learn it around a middle C, so you learn a different chord voicing. You're not playing it in root position, you're playing it in, second position or whatever. And so you learn these things and it becomes like a kind of instinctive side, where you know what the chord tones are. And I'd not really thought about it until later on, because when I started playing bass, I just kind of obviously knew what those notes were, and I thought, everybody knows that, because everybody's tinkered around on piano. But of course, when you start teaching, you're teaching somebody that's never seen a piano keyboard, the whole thing. If all you've ever seen is a bass fretboard, it can be pretty confusing for a start, because you're not seeing the black and white keys, you're not seeing the fact that you've got an octave just laid out there. You don't learn chords in the same way, and I think for any bass player that wants to kind of become that wants to take the playing to a level that they want, if they're wanting to really develop, I think everybody has to at least play a bit of keys. Without that, you don't see the whole picture.
And I would definitely, because sometimes people say, hey, guitar would practically even give me the same opportunity. I'm like, yes, but it's still a stringed instrument, and I feel like the guitar, if I had to choose between the two, the guitar is a lot more difficult, because it's got the component of the fingerboard, and it's got the range as well for you to explore harmony very openly. So, the keys is like, you just really see it, and you can really hear it, and just the fact that you can actually create the separation of your function, the bass, versus the harmony, and how you control the music. The bass controls the music, and unfortunately, bass players usually don't see that, or hear that, rather.
Yeah.
So, some level of keys, because, I only started practicing keys, or really getting into it, getting my fingering and all that stuff, like last year through COVID, from the start of the pandemic. But before that, my main harmonic references, like I mentioned earlier, was bass, and then a little bit of guitar. But then it's still so hard to see it. Like, for instance, you take a shape of a C major 7, a C, B, E, right? That's a voicing B bass players like. And then just moving the C to C sharp gives you C sharp minor 7 without the fifth.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, even that, it's such a simple thing, but it's two different sounds. And there is a certain inability to actually hear that distinction and understand it and try to dig deeper with it. So I feel like on the piano, it's so much more laid out that you can do it with a lot more ease. And then it just translates real easy too.
Oh, yeah. If you try explaining to somebody what an add 9 chord is, right? Just a basic add 9 chord. It's like the most simple chord. And you're only talking to a bass player that's never done anything, in terms of keys or anything like that. And you try explaining that. You're like, right, okay, well, it's the major triad. It's got this added ninth. And if you're doing it on piano, it's really obvious. You just see it, and it's just... and you sometimes even do it by mistake.
Yeah.
You can end up in the, the ninth or whatever. It's just like a little you know. But on bass, it's like all of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's like theory. I think that's why bass players get so caught up in all this theory thing before they've actually started learning any music that applies that, you know, because if you say, okay, well, these are added note chords, these are extended chords, that, you know, you're running through the cycle of all of this theory stuff. But on a piano, you just end up, it's just there, you know, you just, you get a C major, and then you just move the root to the B, you know, on a C major, and then you got a major 7. It's like, oh, right, yeah, it's just that, you know, it's just so easy to see.
Yeah, and it's easy to see, sometimes very subtle to the ear, but then you hear the shift as well in the harmony or whatever it is. And yeah, so it's funny because ever since I decided, I want to practice more keys, I stopped using my bass during lessons now. I rarely touch it. Everything's on the piano because I just want everyone to hear it. You know, occasionally I might share screen just to show the keys and say, hey, you see that B, now it's going to go to B flat, and watch what happens and listen to what happens. And then listen to what happens when you include the bass. So from a study standpoint and just from being able to build your hearing, I think it's great. Because the one other trouble I ran into on the bass when I was spending so much time studying harmony was just not how muddy it is, but just how, depending on where you play, at least for me, I have this issue. Like sometimes a certain pitch doesn't sound exactly the way it should be sounding, or just some other way of hearing or seeing things. So, and I've spoken to a few other players about this, you know, like Hadrian and a bunch of guys who I know spent a lot of time on the bass rather than anything else. Yeah, because someone like Hadrian did everything on the bass, but I think, I mean, he's a special kind of an animal. That's a different story, you know. But
not a good example of normal
exactly. So
people.
I was just like, okay, you did that, but I'm not going to go there. So I felt like I needed to branch out into something else. Plus, I mean, trying to develop harmonic language on the bass comes with a particular cost on your wrist health, at least. That's what happened to me. But yeah, I definitely encourage any and every bass player, just get a simple MIDI controller, just 25 keys, just doesn't have to be full range. Just practice little things and it'll really go a long way.
So talk about your background then. So how did you get started? How old were you when you got started?
I started playing music when I was 12. So I got my first guitar at 12, you know, and I was going to a nice church out here in the Middle East. And prior to that, in school, I think I was 9 or, I'm trying to remember, grade 3 or 4, I started studying Carnatic music, South Indian classical music. But that was voice. And I hated it because it's just so damn hard. And so that was going on, and then I had the guitar thing happening. But the one thing I had a knack for since I was a baby was the drums. So as much as I was practicing guitar, I ended up playing drums first in the church band, and that just went on. So I grew up playing a lot of gospel, and then somewhere down the road, my brother shows me the Black Album, Metallica, and I'm just like, I dig this, you know. So it kind of took me into a different zone altogether, musically speaking. Because I had the gospel thing happening, and then on the other side there was the whole heavy metal, thrash metal stuff happening, and then I got into Pantera, Slayer, and all that. I mean, I still listen to that stuff. It's kind of what really got me. I think that's the music that convinced me I want to do music, you know. So from there, that was pretty much all I was playing, gospel and heavy metal. Then I went to music college for a bit, and went in as a guitar major, you know, shredding away all my John Petrucci chops, very poorly, of course. And then somewhere before that, I was already playing a little bass, but you know how guitar players play a little bass, right? Which is basically, hey, C major, I can play a C, you know, that's bass playing. So I was doing that a little bit, but in college, in my batch, I remember there was one bass player. And then in my senior batch, there were probably 2 guys. So there's like 4 bass players and like 60 guitar players. And I was just like, man, that sucks, because these guys have to play for everybody's recital. And then people started calling me and saying, hey, you play a little bass, right? And I'm like, yeah, sure. I started playing a lot. I started playing so much bass that I actually forgot that I was a guitar major at one point. And then my mentor just looked at me and said, hey, you should just probably consider switching to it, because not to say you're a bad guitar player, but you already play it well. Why not study something you don't know that well? And that honestly is something that has stuck with me, and I think will stick with me for life. The whole logic of doing something that you don't know, trying to learn that, because for instance, if you take someone like Antonio Sanchez, phenomenal drummer, we all know that, but he was a piano major in his studies, which goes to show that, because it takes a certain level of confidence for you to say, yeah, I'm a drummer, but I'm going to try majoring in a different instrument for say, So, yeah, so that's how I got into bass. But what really, really got me into the bass was just listening to Weather Report the first time and hearing Jaco and just going, what the hell is that, And yeah, from there on, kind of really got into that. I was exclusively playing fretless for a few years, and yeah, so it just started to evolve a lot from there, from that point when I was in college up until I started gigging a lot. And yeah, I think for me, one of the things I definitely have to give credit for my growth and evolution was I was fortunate to work with a lot of people who really accepted me bringing myself to the table, as opposed to being forced to just be a functional bass player, So, for instance, I used to play with quite a popular Malaysian pop artist, but I only used to play a fretless. Even if the song needed slap, I used to just play it on the fretless, because I just connected with it. If you gave me a fretted, I would have done it, but it didn't feel like me. But there was an openness in that sense where people just let me express, no matter what the nature of the gig was. And I think that played a huge role too. But yeah, started around when I was 12, and yeah, I would say it got serious around the time I turned 16 or 17, around there. That's when I started to realize, yeah, this is pretty much what I want to be doing. Because up until then, funny enough, I actually wanted to be an automobile engineer because I love cars. And I had a whole plan. Yeah, I can intern with McLaren, Formula One and this and that. And then everyone in my church is just like, man, you should do music, And I was just like, okay, let's try this out. And yeah, from that to here, it's funny because looking back from where I started to where I am today, I would have never imagined I'd be here, particularly doing the music that I'm doing now, which is why probably people from our high school and pre-college days, they can't relate to me anymore, actually, because what they are seeing is just two really different people. So yeah, that's been interesting because it's almost been a complete change in identity, considering where I started and where I am today. So yeah, that is a long answer to your question.
Yeah, it's almost the same as my story, to be honest, because the way, and I actually think there's a lot of people that go through exactly that same set of kind of stepping stones. Like when I started out on bass, it was all metal. I was a Pantera, all that, And basically because I was in a band with some guys from school, and it was like I was into Anthrax and Pantera and Metallica and all that, and it was just that's all we did, which I think as a beginner was actually quite good, because as much as you're not listening to Jaco Pastorius at that point, the technical. And they're not technical in the Hadrian Thoreau sense, but it's harder than the average kind of pop stuff that you might do, because you're having to learn these riffs, especially if you get into Dream Theater and things like that. And because you kind of love the style so much, you become kind of embedded in all of that. And I think it's handy to get really obsessed with a style like that. Talking to Yannick Wisdala a few weeks ago, it sounds like he got into jazz immediately. It was like he started straight away, and I kind of envy him in a way, because it took me so long to then make that transition.
Right.
It wasn't until I went to music college that I really got into jazz and stuff like that. I was into classical music, so that kind of helped. But then, and I think that happens so much for people, that they start on the metal thing, and then you go to music college, and then it's like, oh, I can't play blue bossa. I'm gonna have to do something about this. And then you start working on that and autumn leaves and all that lot. And then before you know it, you're kind of listening to jazz and thinking, okay, it's not Pantera, but I'm kind of digging this. And then it just goes from there, doesn't it? But it's obviously seeing a lot of the soloing style, because I know that there's a lot more to you than just soloing, but the thing that's going to catch the eye for a lot of people is going to be a lot of the chops and a lot of the Coltrane-esque kind of lines that you sometimes come out with. And actually a lot of because the way that you'll play pentatonic lines will often be quite different, rather than the stereotypical kind of pentatonics that you get. I kind of think of Evan Merian as well in a little bit like that, like he uses hexatonics and stuff to get a different sound out of all of that. And your lines kind of have that vibe. So what stuff specifically did you practice when you were developing that vocabulary?
For me, it primarily was born out of one simple concept. For instance, you mentioned the hexatonic. So let's say you have a C major hexatonic, and you could do a C, D, E, G, A, B. So essentially a C major scale without the F, But typically what's going to happen is that you give this scale to anybody, they're going to use it against a C major. For me, I always try to go away from that. So I would use that hexatonic against an F major.
Right.
So by default, I'm going to start on a non-chord tone. I mean, not a non-chord tone, but not on a root. I could start on an extension, but I have direction with it. So I started to lean towards that. And this was all derived from a video of Jeff Berlin, actually. It's an old instruction video of his where he's talking about playing chord tones on the blues.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing it, and I was just like, I don't think that's just thirds and sevenths. It doesn't sound like it.
No.
Then I kept listening and listening more, and I was just like, it still doesn't sound like it, but it is thirds and sevenths. And I'm just like, how do you do that? So I started thinking about that, and I just kind of built a simple routine in the sense where I would take any and every standard, pull up backing tracks or whatever, and try to play the thirds, just hold the thirds, long notes, but do it real time, instead of trying to look at it and give myself the time to figure out what the thirds are. And sure enough, in doing that, you take a song like All the Things You Are, the melody is built around the thirds. So you start to kind of hear how these few notes kind of paint a picture against the harmony. And slowly but surely, I started to build my vocabulary like that. All of this while avoiding playing anything that has to do with the root. So if I have an F minus 7, I don't want to play F Dorian. I don't want to go there because I'm going to be bound to the note F. That's going to become everything. So instead of thinking F Dorian, just think E flat major, because that by default starts me in a different note. And it sounds different while it's still the same note. So that is something I spent, and I continue to spend a lot of time on, is that logic of, if the chord says this, I want to state what the chord is implying, but I don't want to make it obvious. It's like the analogy I use is like, how often would you say your name when you introduce yourself to somebody for the first time? You say it once at most. Doing it a second time, probably in conversation, because the person probably forgot your name, so you say, yeah, Anthony or Mark. So in that sense, I look at the root note in a soloing context the same way, And on the flip side, I know some guys who are trying to get or incorporate more root note based ideas because everything sounds so far apart,
Yeah.
So, yeah, essentially that is one of the things. And the other thing, which I have had the chance to explore so well on the piano, but the same logic, is how piano players can create movements that are possibly not there in the existing harmony, just with their left hand, imply something and actually play it. So I spent a lot of time trying to imagine that implied harmony in my head. So if I have a G7, I'm trying to think of a B flat 7 in my head, just go that diminished route and play it against the G. Just hear that for a sec. What does that sound like? How much tension and release is there? And again, using the same principles, even if I'm playing B flat 7, I might not necessarily start from the B flat. even though I'm playing against G. So it's like no matter what you get into, I think there is always a way to link one concept to the other or one idea. And yeah, so just really incorporating this into every way possible in melodic minor harmony, diminished harmony, and then I started getting into the whole Messiaen modes. I started exploring the logic behind it because it was intriguing, like the modes of limited transposition. And I was just like,
Yeah.
that's cool. So you have limited transpositions, which means everything is kind of encompassed in these 3 or 4 scales just because of symmetry and like these kind of things. So I definitely spent a lot of time building that foundation of a chord is here, take a step back, play around it, don't state the obvious, and keep common links between everything that you practice and explore, basically. And yeah, that I think in itself is something that can be expanded into a lot of things down the road. But it's...
What kind of... so when you're thinking in terms of... I mean, we're really talking about, well, not polytonality, but we're thinking of implying other scales over a particular chord. So when you're practicing the scales, because you were talking scales rather than simply chord tones there, when you're practicing scalar lines, what kind of thought processes have you got going on while you're actually playing through those scales? Because obviously, to a lot of people out there, if you were to say, okay, well, we're going to play through this F Dorian scale or whatever, the standard thing that people do when they've never, really done much in terms of improvisation, they're just going to run up and down the scale, or things like that. So what kind of advice would you give on actually developing lines through a scale?
So one thing scales give you a lot easier than arpeggios or chord tones is just the ability to actually flow. If you think about it, if I want to play a 2-octave C major 7 arpeggio, you can make it flow, but it's a lot more difficult than actually playing the scale.
Yeah. Stepwise motion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now when you think of a scale, if I decide to skip the consecutive note, it's technically a third, and so on and so forth. So within the framework of a scale, if I wish to enter the chord tone territory, it's right there under my fingers. And you can also do the opposite version where if I play chord tones, I just have to hit the in-between notes for my scale tones. So in terms of practice, like I used to, this is something I pretty much make all my students do, is just take 2 sets of chords. They don't necessarily have to do anything with each other in a diatonic sense. They can literally be anything, maybe one major 7 and another minor 7, and pick the appropriate scale for each. And then just literally run it up and down. But the main thing to focus on is the transition between the 2 chords. We are either heavily reliant on the root or a chord tone to make the transition happen. But practicing just your scales will allow you to hit a non-chord tone as a transition note into the next chord. And then you can stack a 3rd chord, a 4th. An easy song in a very... not literal sense, but technical sense, is Giant Steps that way, because it's just 3 scales. It's just 3 major scales, but it's that change, that B major 7 into D7. What trips up people is just not knowing what note to hit against the D7 as a transition. But then when you think of it from the angle of scales, and then let's say I end up hitting the F sharp at some point in between, right in between the chords, I can hold on, I can repeat that F sharp or just hold it, because that's the 3rd for D. So you start to develop an ear in that sense based on common tones between chords, how that common tone serves a purpose, and how can you get there without having to stop and reset and then play, which is why I like to incorporate scale practice where it's going to sound mundane, it's going to sound very dull, but the minute you just get more comfortable with that, you can start to understand how to create these deviations within that. So instead of playing consecutive notes, you play a 3rd, and then from there, maybe a chromatic passage down, which is taking you into a slightly different territory again, which is, again, why I encourage people, stay away from practicing with a metronome or a backing track directly. Just, if possible, if you have keys, just drone a chord and just really play, and then when you feel like, hey, I want to change to the next chord, change the chord and continue from where you left off, basically. So it really just comes down to continuity of how you carry forward scales. And because, I do tend to talk a lot more about scales than the chord tone thing. But this is primarily why, because the chord tone thing, like in my experience and the way I was using it, I just could not get it to flow as well.
It's angular.
It's very angular, and for me, it tends to sound a little corny on the electric bass. That's just how I feel. Like on the upright, I love the whole chord tone thing. It just sounds right. I don't know why in my head that's the way it's kind of, but on the electric, I feel like the instrument has the ability to take you elsewhere. So scales do that rather well for me. And just focusing on continuity and just transition points, regardless of them being chord tones or non-chord tones. Yeah.
And it's such a difficult exercise for anybody out there that's not tried that. I remember, back in the early 90s, I remember a column. A friend of mine used to get his guitar magazine, and I'd get Bass Player magazine. And then there used to be columns in the guitar magazine, and I think it was in Guitar or something like that. And Joe Hubbard had a column in there, and I used to cut out the bass columns from his magazine, and I had a folder full of them. I told him this when I interviewed him. It was so embarrassing, and I think I've still got them all. But one of them, he was talking about this exercise that I've seen loads of people mention, and it's pretty much what you're mentioning there. So starting on the lowest note on the instrument and then just working in stepwise motion, basically through whatever scale it is in the harmony, to the top of the fretboard and back down again as one continuous line, while changing the notes that you're playing based on what that harmony is. And like you said, if you pick two random chords, it's going to do some pretty odd changes as you're going up. I mean, sometimes it's not too odd, because sometimes they might be related in some kind of weird way, so it might not be as hard as it looks on those. But even on a 2-5-1, as you're moving up, if it then all of a sudden changes, if it's like on a standard where you're working through consecutive 2-5-1s, all of a sudden you're shifting. You might be shifting down a key, but you're still ascending through the line. And you can't just think of one major scale. You're thinking, oh. And of course, you've got to know your notes on the neck. You've got to know the whole fretboard. And you get into the top and going, now I've got to come down. And it's such a nightmare. I remember seeing that, and I was just floored because I couldn't do it. I started and I thought, I don't know my neck well enough. It was such an eye-opening experience and like a humbling experience, because at that point I was into Billy Sheehan and everything. I thought I was the bee's knee, shredding away. And then I just saw that one exercise that was basically just consecutive eighth notes going up and down the neck, and I was like, I can't do that. I don't even know how I would do that. And it's still, I mean, I don't care who you are. It's it's a pretty tough exercise to do, to start at the open E, go all the way up to the top of however many frets you've got, and back down through the harmony. It's, and that's basically what you're saying, working through the chords.
And I even pushed it further by just doing it one string at a time. And even like, I remember sitting and practicing giant steps up to speed on one string, but keeping the same thought process. So obviously, to play continuous eighth notes on one string is not going to be possible, but that's the idea. Wherever I stop, I continue from there, based on whatever the harmony is. So I feel like it also teaches you to think on your feet. It actually teaches you to actually improvise, if you think about it. Because if you hit something that you didn't mean to, it's okay. Just pick yourself up and just go from there. Because I think one thing in particular today's bass players are very afraid of is playing something wrong. Or just being afraid they'll get called out because, you played a major 7 against a dominant, man. That's not cool. I'm like, it doesn't matter. What matters is how you recover, or just what happens next. So, it's...
Oh, man. I did a lesson a couple of weeks ago on transcription and about... I'd been working through Billy's Bounce for a few lessons. And then finally, on the final lesson, I worked through Miles' solo on the original recording. And like that solo, the reason I did the solo was because it was a lot easier than Bird's solo on it.
Yeah.
there's not that much to it. But man, the actual notes he's playing in there, when I actually broke it down, and there was, because I wanted to explain what was going on in the solo, I thought, there's not that. I'd never learned that bit of I'd never learned Miles' solo in there. And after I learned it, I was like, hold on, this sounds great. It sounds really nice. But it makes hardly any sense in the harmony,
Right.
The second half of the solo, it just, like you say about putting a major 7 over a chord with a minor 7th in it, and he's blatantly putting them in there, and it's like it's not even thinking of, it's not gonna work or whether it's gonna work. It's just like, this is the note, this is what I'm putting in there. I don't care. This is what I want the sound to be like, and it's like you say, it's not about getting the actual harmony necessarily right. It's what you're actually doing with it. I know that Jeff Berlin would probably say that, no, that's not right. There are right notes and wrong notes, but
I mean,
I know.
yeah, I mean,
it's a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, from a beginning study standpoint, yes, right and wrong notes are a very, it's a good distinction to have. But beyond that, when you want to get creative, you really, the only way to do it is to just really think of how, like, because, I ask people the same question. It's like, you're playing over a blues. Are you playing based on knowing the harmony, or you're hearing it from the track, or the mates you're playing with, or how are you actually playing over it? Because for me, a lot of things can change that depending on how good my morning cup of coffee was. My ear might not work as well, which means I'm bound to default to a few things, which I might not be happy with, but hey, I just have to get through the gig or get through the recording or whatever it is. So those are things that are very tricky to teach, because I feel like they're almost impossible to teach, but I think it's important to talk about them at least. Talk about these components which actually make up music, because all things said and done, you'd look at chord tones, scales, yada, 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 but at the end of the day, there are many that find themselves, like even I found myself in a situation where I knew a lot and I just still couldn't make music, so I just had to really let go, get loose. And funny enough, like I mentioned that Jeff Berlin video, and then another video that really got to me, that really made me realize, man, I know my fretboard, but not in the sense that I thought I knew, was there's this old video of Schofield doing a clinic where he's just playing the modes of the major scale. So he's like, minor 7, cool, this is Dorian, Phrygian, but it doesn't sound like it. It just doesn't. Till date, it doesn't sound like it, which made me realize just how his perception is of sound, rather than, this mode has that Dorian, that 6. People go at that 6, A minor 7, I'm going to keep hitting that F sharp, which is cool, but there are 6 other notes. You could sidestep to B flat and come back, which is what a piano player might do. Like these kind of small things, which really comes down to just exploration. So I mean, this is another thing I tell almost all my students is, sure, keep a regimented routine in terms of academic practice, but also take time out to explore, where all of that, you just throw it aside and just sit and try something out. Try to play something you never played before. It could be just 2 notes, but it's something you never did before, so 2 good stuff.
Yeah, it's good for your ear more than anything. Yeah. I mean, you play that off. You play a note that doesn't work over or that shouldn't work over a particular chord, and if you didn't know how that note sounded before you did it, well, once you've done it,
now you know.
You're going to know what it sounds like. Whether you want to do it again.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So when do you do much transcription?
Man, to be honest, no. I can count and tell you how many transcriptions I've done over the last 10 years. I've probably transcribed maybe between 12 to 15 solos at most. Definitely not more. And this includes, transcriptions that I actually wrote out versus stuff I just memorized. I primarily transcribe to build my technique, not my vocabulary.
Right.
So, having said that, I transcribe harmony a lot. So, I would sit and listen to Maria Schneider or Vince Mendoza or stuff like that, and I would pick apart the string writing, the horn writing. Just that is where I actually spent a lot of my time, and I still spend a lot of my time transcribing, because I feel like not only is it underrated, but I feel like that gives me more leverage in terms of melody.
Yeah.
It teaches me to hear a melody within the existing melody too. So I feel like it's got more value for it, in terms of how it's benefiting me. But yeah, besides that, I don't really transcribe a lot unless I really like what I hear. Sometimes I hear certain clips of certain players. I'd be like, I really like that one phrase. It does not even the entire phrase, just the way it resolves. Like, it's funny, like one solo that comes to mind, which I know 8 out of 10 bass players who are into fusion would have transcribed, is Scully Sverrisson on Low Levels High Stakes, Alan Holdsworth. I mean, I love the entire solo, but there is one phrase in that solo which I didn't even have to transcribe because it was so melodic and direct and straightforward. And when I heard it and I played it, I just fell in love with that one phrase, and that was all I tried to play. I didn't bother with the rest of the solo. And it's not because I felt like it was beneath me or whatever. No, because that one moment was really where it just hit me. And I don't want to work my way through the entire thing to get to the moment that made the connection with me. So that's why I tell people, anyone who wants to get into transcription, is transcribe what you connect with first. Because, it's funny you mentioned playing metal and stuff. Technically speaking, we were transcribing from those days already. Because it's not like you could make up your own bass line over Master of Puppets, right? You had to play what you had to play. You had to play that, whatever that, was it a 5 or just Lars Ulrich skipping a beat, whatever it is, you technically transcribed it. But for some reason, when the transcription gets put into the context of jazz and soloing, it just becomes completely different the way people approach it. For me, I approach it the same way, based on how I liked the song or how I connected with it. And cherry pick it, moments that I liked. Like, I think technically speaking, my first guitar solo I ever transcribed was Fade to Black, Metallica. And I never bothered transcribing the outro solo. Not because of anything, but I liked the opener. So, yeah, that's my simple take on transcribing. I think it's beneficial. I think everyone should try it if they've never tried it, but it can also be a trap. So I would say just be mindful of that, But
it's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of people, if they don't transcribe stuff that they love or that they're really attracted to, in terms of, like you say, even if it's just one phrase, it can become a chore, and it just becomes you can get put off pretty quick, because if it's stuff that you're not really into, and it's just because someone's told you, oh, this is what you're supposed to be transcribing. You're supposed to transcribe, this Charlie Parker solo or whatever, and you're not really digging it. You're not going to get the benefits of it. You need to transcribe the stuff that you love. Like you say, I just spend all my time transcribing metal tunes at first, and a lot of it's chromatic. It doesn't really have much kind of functional diatonic harmony going on. It's just, and you actually get a good ear for like chromatic things, especially Metallica. There's like minor seconds and flat fives and stuff, and you really get to know that. And like every time I'm describing intervals, if I ever show a minor second or a flat 5, I'm always going to be like, it's that metal one, because it's the thing that people will relate to. But I suppose if you're not from that background, you wouldn't be thinking, it's like Cannibal Corpse, I don't
know. Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because you always have a particular way of relating. Just even just two notes, the intervallic relationship between them can be easily tied down to that sound, you know. So it's like, so the transcribing thing, like, I'm just remembering now that I did a couple of Charlie Parker solos, but I never actually transcribed them. I just read them off the Omnibook, because it was a chore for me, to be honest, because I was not digging Charlie Parker at the time, but I was told to. Yeah. And then, me being the lazy bum I was then, I just looked it up. Oh, Omnibook, let me check this out. Oh, nice, confirmation. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to read. Yeah. Funny enough, years later, I went back and I transcribed Billy's Bounce, which you just mentioned. And that was when I was just like, I really dig this guy. I could not dig it then. which is okay. I think it's fine to not like something just because everyone likes it,
But it's so hard to sometimes learn them from things like the Omnibook, because I remember learning, there was a particular line, it was a very stereotypical bird line, that one of the 16th note lines, and it's like, that starts flying up the neck. And they're so difficult to play on bass, some of those lines, unless you can really find the right fingering, especially when you're reading it, because when you're reading it, you're kind of getting trapped into how you would instinctively play it when you read it. Like everybody has this way of, I don't care what people say, if you're reading, you're going to read it the way that it kind of falls right under your fingers. There's a like, if I am reading a certain note on the stave, there's going to be a way that I normally jump to it. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the easiest way to play it. And I mean, sometimes you can find some really crazy fingerings that work for these things. So I remember learning one of those lines, and it was from the Omnibook. And later, years later, I came back and retranscribed it for myself. One thing I noticed is that the transcription in the Omnibook was wrong. I was like, this isn't the notes at all. And then the way that I learned it from my ear, I found a completely different way of playing it. And it was just so much easier under the fingers, because I think sometimes with the transcriptions, they'll put notes in there where it might be more of a lipping up and glissing into things, or things where it's really just, you could even just do it with a slide, like, little things like that. But every little thing is transcribed in the Omnibook, and it's
some of the
and like I say, some of it's even wrong.
Yeah, some of the notations are too literal. It could be even like a bunch of bum notes or ghost notes even. But that's why I said, like, transcribing really helps you develop this exactly, because when you read something, you play it a certain way. Because when I read Confirmation, I remember in his solo, he plays this double time phrase. It's like, what? So when I read it, I remember I spent I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2 weeks on just that phrase after I read it. Because then I went back to listening to the recording, and I just kind of found a contour to the way it sounded, and I realized, I could play it this way, which basically meant leading with my index and then finishing off with the pinky, which I did not do because of reading. I had already placed myself to play it another way. So that in turn forced me to reevaluate everything I learned up until that point. So I mean, I only said that because just to reiterate how I was hesitant to transcribe something I was told to, and I chose the easy way out, but it was not easy. I think it would have been easier to actually transcribe now that I think about it.
Well, I'm finding it really interesting asking, now I'm doing these interviews and I'm asking various people about how they've actually learned. And especially with jazz improvisation, how transcription can and cannot, how it does and doesn't play a role with certain people. Like Yannick is all about transcription, obviously. He's like, the amount of books that he's made of them, he just like reams and reams and reams of them. And it's like, obviously it's worked for him really, really well. But then you'll find other people, like you were saying about yourself, that it's not like, this vast number of transcriptions. It's just like picking little bits up here and there. And it just shows that there's like no one way really at all with any of this stuff, because the standard way, let's say that Yannick was teaching jazz improvisation, he'd say, get out there and transcribe, just transcribe everything that you can, learn the vocabulary and stuff. But obviously, you're a perfect example of someone where it's not necessarily the only path.
Yeah, it's one of, I won't say many, it's one of a few. For me, one of the reasons I stayed away from transcribing is because it's probably my ego, because I always felt like I don't want to be playing somebody else's lines, be inspired to have my own vocabulary based on that, because that's still me using somebody's word at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So and also because this was at a phase in my bass playing where I was trying my best to walk away from the bebop sound, because that was literally all I could play, that enclosure and the chromatic approach stuff, which I still use, but I use it very differently today because I stopped transcribing. It also meant I had to stop listening to certain players. Like, it's been, I think, I only listened to Hadrian when he dropped his last record, and I haven't listened to him in a few years. I just don't. Not because, I mean, the guy is great, but I needed to just stop getting that. I don't want it rubbing off on me anymore, you know. And still people might say, oh, you've got the Hadrian thing happening, and I can't blame people for hearing it that way. But, yeah, so you really have to just weigh out the overall pros and cons. But it is something I think everyone has already done. If not, try it out. It's pretty fun.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I would definitely recommend people do is go check out your it's two albums that you've got out now, isn't it? They're both out on Spotify. And one thing that, I mean, they're great albums. And like I said, I've been listening to your first album quite a lot. And few things that really stand out to me on that one is your interest in rhythm. Because there's a few things in there. Like the first thing that stood out to me, I think it's the very first tune. Okay, is it Epilogue? Is it the very first tune on the first one? And I remember listening to it because, like, I'm massively into like odd rhythm, right? So anytime anything's got something like odd rhythm in it, I'm like, oh right, okay. And first of all, I was thinking, oh, okay, this is in 5, and then I thought, hold on, this isn't in 5 at all. These are quintuplets, and he's got this in. I think I'm right with this anyway. I think it's that what initially sounds like 5/16 or 5/8 is actually quintuplets, and then everything else is kind of playing in 4/4 around it. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, it's basically the idea was metric modulation. It's you. Because that's one thing I like to explore a lot. I want to state the same thing, but from two perspectives simultaneously, if I can. So on that song, yes, the piano riff is quintuplets. The drums and bass are playing very straight 4. But then at some point, the drums and bass switch to a 5/4, and then it comes back to the melody. It was quite funny because when I had to play that live with my group, that song took a long time to get together. Because it's just something that is hard to just kind of be like, yeah, cool, I get it. And then you play it, it's just like things start to either speed up or slow down. So, yeah, I tend to do that a lot. Like, and I like doing that with odd time because I feel like it creates this, not just illusion, but people can kind of relate to it, even though it's a little obscure. Like off of the second record that I just put out in February, on track 7, I have this section which is in 21/8, but the drums technically are playing in 42/4, technically speaking, because it's just creating this overlapping rhythm, but it gives a pulse that people can hold on to, and then there's a melody that's kind of sewn in. So this is honestly definitely thanks to the early influence of studying South Indian classical music as a kid. I never realized that it had rubbed off on me to this extent in the way I approach writing. Because, I feel like that's the strange thing about rhythm. It is either overstudied or understudied. It's never in the middle, Because you would see certain cats, they go to Timbuktu with rhythms and this and that, which is great. I love that stuff, but I'd like to kind of dial it down a bit, try to make it relatable. So. Yeah, you're definitely right in the way you thought of it. That's definitely one way to do it, yeah.
Yeah, I think Void as well. Is it Void? That one's 15/16, I think. I spotted that one, I think.
Void is actually in... Wait, now you're making me think. I think that's in...
I think it was... There's like a... It's almost like a 2/4 and then a... Is it a 2/4 and then a 7/16, I think. There's however it starts, because there's a bass... There's a bass riff at the beginning, and it does the little skipping thing. So it's almost like
that's actually in 7. But but you see,
I've counted an extra.
Extra 16. But I can kind of understand why, because again, it's the skipping and the syncopation element of it that makes it feel a little lopsided. So these are two things I really toy around with. Is metrically modulating the same subdivision into a different subdivision, and the other one is just syncopation to flip things around. Like the last song on the record is also in 7, but a lot of people just get so confused with the drum groove, because they listen to the hi-hats and they relate to that as a quarter note, but it's actually a dotted 8th, for instance, and then there's a backbeat, and then the turnaround just kind of makes you flip. So I use that a lot. And the cool thing with this is that if you use it sparingly, you can really have a lot of tricks in your bag, so to speak, like in terms of how you can, not just in composition, but even in arranging, it really comes in handy.
Yeah, I've always been obsessed with that stuff. I'm a huge Zappa fan, and I'm into a lot of classical stuff that's like that as well. Like Messiaen, I'm really into that, and does a lot of like additive and subtractive kind of meter and things. And so every time I hear anything like that, I'm like, oh, what's this we've got here? So yeah, and it actually sets it apart a little bit, because when I like those two albums, because I'd say, in terms of, if people haven't heard it, there's quite a bit of a kind of Alan Holdsworth kind of vibe to the sound of it. It's got that kind of fusion flavour, but that rhythmic aspect is what kind of differentiates it from a lot of other. Because in a way, it kind of has a lot more groove in that sense. It's kind of like, I think sometimes if you're going to, because with a lot of odd time stuff, you end up kind of being forced into being very ostinato based, and which in turn gives it a kind of repetitive thing, which with a lot of fusion stuff, especially the more out there, it can end up being very stoppy-starty and kind of, like Spartan.
Very choppy.
Yeah, whereas you've got that kind of rolling kind of vibe going on. And like you say, with like things like 7 and 5 and 21 and time signatures like that, there's always going to be, if you're going to be outlining them, you're going to have that skip at the end, which kind of gives it almost like a clave kind of vibe a lot of the time. So you've kind of always got this kind of... It's like people always think that, like, odd time signatures, you can't dance to odd time signatures. And I always think the way that most odd time signatures are presented, especially if it's in a groove format, I think it almost makes them more danceable, because you've got that kind of skip.
Yeah. It is interesting, because even because I have a whole bunch of my high school friends and just general friends who are not musicians, but the songs they relate to are usually the most rhythmically obscure ones. Because it's like what you said, it's in the way you hear it, and I think that comes out in the way you also present it, because this ties down to what I was talking about earlier, the whole influence of other instruments against the bass or anything else. Because the way I lay out a particular section, I can push the piano and the voice to sing the melody a certain way, but I can put the drums and bass way behind and make them think in a bigger space. So instead of thinking 7, they would think maybe 14, or maybe 3.5. And then put everything else forward, push it a little bit more. So rhythmically and from a time field perspective, you can really toy around with a lot of things. And this also gives you the added advantage of how you place the harmony in terms of rhythm. That's one thing I always I do it on practically every song, just rhythmic shifts for the harmony as well, even if the melody doesn't follow it or something, So, it's very true, because a song that comes to mind, which is very ostinato driven, and in 7 is, I remember Michel Camela had a version with Dave Weckl, I think. What's it? Tombo in 7/4?
Right.
Very groovy. The A section, the B section is all in 7, and the chorus goes to like a samba in 4. But that 7... while it is repetitive, it might not be my cup of tea, but it's groovy. It just really grooves so hard. And every time I've done that in the past, people just move to it, even though they're probably not realizing why they're even moving or how they're able to move to something so odd. 7 Days from Sting. Anyone can move to that, But who's going to ever think it's in 5? But of course, that's Vinny on the kit, so...
Which you'd think would make it even less danceable.
Exactly.
But it does. I think it's the offbeat, and I think also if you were to say, okay, well, here's a typical disco rhythm, do 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 do, is that danceable? And then you think of something like ticka 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 ticka, and you think, okay, well, that's going to be like a 7 vibe. Well, which one sounds more funky? Well, it's the 7 one with the ticka 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 instead of bum bum bum.
Yeah, because you need something beyond that. The syncopated element of it, that really plays a huge part into it, So it's like, it's definitely very interesting to think about. Yeah.
But yeah, those albums are great. The new one, What's it called? The new one.
Perennial.
That's it. Yeah. So that was released. Was that released during the pandemic?
Yeah, end of February this year.
Oh right.
Yeah,
So did you write that during the pandemic?
Yeah, I wrote the entire thing during the pandemic, with the exception, I believe, there's a couple of tunes on there that I wrote a few years ago, which I kind of revamped, refurbished a little, but everything else was written during the pandemic. Yeah.
How did you go about recording it? Did you have anybody doing like remote recording, or did you actually do it in a studio?
No, it's all me.
Did you do everything? I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, same with the first
Wow.
record too. Yeah.
Wow. Because there's some great guitar playing on there.
Yeah. So the first record, I had two soloists, both of my friends who live here, Cuban guys, killer horn players. And for Perennial, yeah, I had a good friend of mine, Rami Lakis, a bass player out in London actually. He played bass on one of the tracks, and I had a couple of my other friends laid on some vocals. But everything else was recorded and mixed right here.
Wow.
Yeah, drums and everything. Yeah, because I really, like I mentioned, I took the opportunity to just try my best to become even more self-sufficient in that sense.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, I could have more guest musicians, but I like to keep the core as consistent as possible, you know?
Yeah.
So, I tracked everything myself right here.
It's mixed really nice as well. The whole vibe of the whole thing sounds great.
Yeah, so the first record was mixed and mastered by my friend who actually mastered the second record. But the second record, I took the additional challenge of mixing it because, again, it's inspired by Holdsworth. Holdsworth mixed all his albums, which is why I think sonically it's so unique because you hear everything that's happening on every song, which I think is it's incredibly difficult to do with that style of music. And especially this whole fusion, that airy kind of fusion in today's world, I don't think you find too many engineers who work with that. So I just decided to just sit and practice the mixing chops as well. So that
it's a good point. That if you went to like a big, commercial studio in like New York or something, and you came in with like the kind of stuff that you're doing, it's like they'll be like, "What is this? What do I do with this?"
Like, I mean, for a lot of engineers, I'm probably using a ridiculous amount of reverb on my guitars in general, but it serves a purpose, because having it there means I can brush it off from the piano or from the voice or play off different things, which is pretty unconventional from an engineering standpoint, I suppose. But that's the fun of music, I think. You have rules, you have boundaries or whatever, but they're all there to be broken. So,
yeah. Nah, that sounds wicked. But yeah, so teaching-wise, you've got your channel, all that's going well. What do you see for the future of that channel? In terms of are you going to keep, following the same kind of path, or are you going to diversify with anything?
Actually, I like this question because I've been getting a lot of questions, particularly after I released the second record, where people realized I recorded the entire thing and mixed the entire thing myself right here in my room. So I am planning to diversify into the more production element of things, and discuss even in terms of just really knowing how to use gear, because people naturally would hear the drums and go, "Oh man, you must have had some killing interface." And I point at this is like 500 USD, and like just small things like that. So I think I want to definitely explore that realm of things. Production, sound design, from a recording angle, and and I think that in itself is a big world. So that is enough content for years to come. That tied in with what I'm generally doing as well, because that's one thing I realized. I've asked this question to many bass players as well who record a lot remotely, is how many of us actually dial in a sound versus actually plug in and call that, like I plug in my bass, okay, I got my sound going, but is that the actual sound you're going for? Because for me, if I do that, I'm usually not able to play a certain way that I need to for the song. So yeah, these are things, again, I'm just really researching and studying it more just to be sure that no one's really done something like this, so to speak, from a very specific musician-focused angle on production, basically. Learning to make the right choices and stuff. So that is definitely the next step in terms of the content and just growing the audience as well. Yeah.
I think that would be really, really popular. People keep asking me more about the basics of recording yourself, that kind of thing, entry level. But I think, especially going by how the albums sound, I mean, you've got a lot to say about that. Like I say, I didn't expect that at all. I didn't expect you to have done all the production side. So I think from the channel angle, I'd love to see that. I'd love to. I'd be a consumer of that material because I'm dead interested.
Yeah, that it's definitely I mean, I was thinking about it, but then at the same time, like I mentioned, although I did do a diploma in sound design ages ago, but I feel like I was not necessarily qualified enough to talk about it. But then I realized technically I'm not even qualified to talk about playing bass because I'm a college dropout. Like, I still don't know how to define a secondary dominant. So I'm just like, actually, you know what? I should just go for it because I think for me, I mean, not to blow smoke up my own ass, but I think for me, my key strength is to simplify anything. That's pretty much what I do. So I think, production is something that can really throw people off, and it rightfully should because it's a different world. But once you really understand things from a very simple place, then you start to realize, oh, okay, anyone can actually do this if they just put their mind to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be really good. And you're right, you do put things in a very, simple manner. I mean, that's the thing that people say about me as well. It's probably
I was just going to say that.
Probably my strength as well, that I'm good at, condensing stuff down.
It's like, you also mentioned how you've got content of all kind, but it's that consistency in how you keep it simple. Anyone can come and take a piece of information from it, or two or three, and get on and try to actually use it. Because I think that simplicity in the way it's presented and the way it's discussed I think we could really use more of that in the world of education.
No matter how complicated you go with any subject, I mean, let's face it, music isn't the most complicated it's not like astrophysics or math or anything like that. But yet you'll still find people wanting to try and overdo it with the actual nuts and bolts of the theory. And I'm sure that sometimes it's just because people want the kind of self-validation, or having somebody say, oh, you're so clever, and it doesn't really help with the actual conveying of the information. Really, the best way to convey any information is to make it as simple as possible so that person can, consume that information. And I think if you were able to do that with especially with the production side of things, that'd be really, really good. Plus, you have a very laid-back kind of manner, which is very, easygoing, and people find that. I mean, I'm a little bit more hyper, but I enjoy watching your stuff because it's a lot more laid back. It kind of chills me out a little bit more.
Right.
But yeah, that would be wicked. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. But anyway, I'll get moving. So thanks very much for that, Anthony. That's eye-opening stuff.
Man, it's my pleasure. It was nice. I dug the conversation, the questions. Nothing to cringe about. So it was really fun. Yeah.